Good afternoon, everyone, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I understand from what I saw on Twitter earlier on that Larry introduced himself as a last-time speaker to your conference, so I suppose this is my first-time speaker and hopefully not my last. But it is a real pleasure to be here, and particularly to recognise the 175th anniversary that you are also marking since the foundation of the EIS. I understand there is a book that will also mark that, although you had the book launch without the book. But when the book finally arrives, I look forward to reading that and learning much more, I'm sure, about the EIS and your campaigning over the years. But I would like to start, it would be remiss for me not to start by expressing my gratitude to Larry for all the work that he has done, the advocacy that he has provided to the profession over the many years, to the Scottish Government, has been absolutely critical to the development of many a policy, Curriculum for Excellence, just to name but one of them. And that constructive challenge, and I would think in the vast majority of cases it's been constructive challenge that we've had between Larry as the General Secretary and the Scottish Government, again, has been very welcomed. And I would pay particular tribute to the work that he has done very recently on expressing his views on behalf of you, the members, to the Scottish Government on the issue of COVID through the Education and Recovery Group. That was a particularly welcome and very valued contribution for that. And I'd also, of course, like to take this opportunity to formally congratulate Andrea for her appointment as General Secretary. I think we have met 4 times this week, Andrea, on 4 different days. I would say that's not normal practice that we meet that regularly, but I do hope that we do have a regular discussion as we move forward over the coming months and years. But before I want to look ahead too much, I want to first of all pay my thanks and record my thanks for the exceptional contribution made by EIS members supporting the education system as a whole, but particularly supporting our children and young people over the past few years. That commitment that has been shown by everyone working to ensure every child, every young person in Scotland still has the opportunity to fill their potential has been absolutely remarkable. I also don't underestimate the significant personal cost that this will have given each and every one of you, as you've also had to deal with the pandemic in your own families and communities. But the fact that we have managed that and we have ensured that children and young people have been supported is very much down to the work of teachers and support staff right across Scotland. And I look forward to the fact that we can perhaps start to look forward to more normality, although I very much recognise that COVID is still with us and the implications of COVID are still very much being felt in classrooms right across the country. But I do hope through the ongoing dialogue between the EIS and other unions, as well as particularly with young people and with parents, that we can keep up the partnership working that has, I think, worked so successfully over COVID to ensure that we keep that dialogue going for whatever the challenges will be in the next academic year. So as you all know far too well, of course, there has been significant disruption caused by COVID, and it has presented serious challenges for learning and teaching in Scotland, just as it has right across the world. There remains a need to address the ongoing impacts for children and young people on their health and well-being and on their learning. And the pandemic has shone a light on the inequalities that were already within our system. Indeed, our International Council of Education Advisors have told us that the pandemic reinforces the issue of equity as a defining agenda item of our times. That's why one of our top priorities within the government is to accelerate both recovery and progress and to tackle the poverty-related attainment gap supported by £1 billion worth of expenditure through the Scottish Attainment Challenge. Progress in tackling the poverty-related attainment gap was made before the pandemic, but we do now need to see an increase in the speed and the scale of that progress. That includes a responsibility to tackle the variation in outcomes that we see both within and across different local authority areas. Now, to achieve these ambitions and our aims for excellence and equity, we need all parts of our system to be working to the highest quality to ensure that we can support you, the teachers, to deliver high quality of teaching. Now, as you'll be aware, Professor Ken Muir's report was published in March and it contained 21 recommendations, and I've accepted those as a starting point for our education reform programme. This obviously includes the creation of a new qualifications body, the creation of a new national agency for Scottish education, a teaching-facing agency for Scottish education, and an independent inspectorate body. Beyond these structural aspects, Ken Muir's report also set us a broader challenge. He asked us to establish a compelling and a consensual vision for the future of Scottish education. And we need to ensure that policy is developed by drawing on the insights of practice. Now, this can only be done, I think, collectively through a discussion between the Scottish Government, COSLA, teachers, learners, school staff, parents, and other stakeholders. And we all have a stake together to be able to deliver success for Scottish education, and I hope we can work together on that new narrative that Ken has challenged us to move forward to. And as we begin to emerge from the pandemic, it's right to reflect on the things about our system that, yes, that were already excellent, and also that have helped our children and young people flourish and realise their ambitions. But important too is to think about what can we learn from the pandemic and what can we do to build, to deliver greater success and at a greater pace. Many people in this room, I'm sure, will recall the national debate which took place 20 years ago. It paved the way for the Curriculum for Excellence, a curriculum which the OECD has described as an inspiring and widely supported philosophy of education. Now, to remain at the forefront of educational thinking, however, we must continually be prepared to ask ourselves what our learners need in order to equip them for the challenges of today's and indeed tomorrow's world. That's why we'll put children and young people at the centre of this national discussion. We need to listen carefully to their views to help us shape the vision for the future and for future generations. And I'm very keen within that we work with teachers in particular to plan our national discussion to ensure it's inclusive of all those interests. And as part of that, I look forward to working with you as we develop our discussion and our wider reform programme. I know that you'll be keen to understand how and when that will be happening, and I hope to make further announcements on that before the end of the term. Now, prior to any reform being implemented, of course, we have an ongoing commitment to ensure that the current cohort of young people have a learning experience that allows them to fulfil their potential. As I hope has been evident from what I've said already, the teaching profession has been pivotal in supporting our young people through the challenges of the last 2 years. As well as providing the required support for learning, this also includes ensuring that learners can demonstrate their potential and achieve the qualifications that reflect that. So I'd like to thank both Larry and Andrea for their valuable contributions to the National Qualifications Group, helping to ensure that system-wide collaborative approaches to the delivery of the assessment and moderation model took place in 2021, and of course a return to exams this year. I appreciate during that process there has been differences of opinions and strongly held views, but the fact that people have came together to look at what's best for our children and young people has to be commended, and I'd thank them again for their very, very constructive contribution through that, even if we couldn't agree all of the time on all of the issues. And I'd like to thank you all for working exceptionally hard to ensure that each individual learner gets the qualifications and grades that they deserve. While I appreciate there is still much work to be done to undertake the finalisation of learners' results this year, I do think it's a testament to your efforts that we have managed a return to the exam diet so smoothly under what have, again, been difficult circumstances. Now, I'd like to turn to the issue of the education workforce and workload. The first thing I would highlight is that teachers and support staff are the most important asset that we have within our education system, and it is those individuals who shape positive outcomes for our learners. So, referring again to the International Council of Education Advisors, they stressed that the demands on teachers increased and expanded over the period of the pandemic, and that teachers urgently need support with their own well-being. On that point, I absolutely recognise that workload is a significant factor in teacher stress, and that's one of the reasons why we have committed to reducing teacher-class contact time by 1.5 hours. Reducing that contact time will also create over 2,000 permanent teaching posts, and as well as reducing workload. You will be well aware, I'm sure, that the SNCT is currently taking discussions forward on this issue, and I very much hope that we will have an implementation date agreed very soon. Similarly, working with partners, we have put in place new resources specifically to support mental health and well-being, coaching and mentoring, while also introducing a new programme of professional learning for early career teachers. We are currently working with Education Scotland and other partners to implement the continuation of wellbeing support into the new school session based on what teachers believe has been right and useful for them. Now, in addition, of course, I know you will be keen to hear my views on teachers' pay, and I absolutely appreciate there has been much discussion about this during your events over the past coming days, and indeed again tomorrow. You'll be aware again that the SNCT negotiations for 2022-23 pay deal have now commenced. I'm aware of the strength of feeling, not just from the past couple of days, but again through the correspondence and dialogue I've had with AIS officials. I know the strength of feeling on this issue, and indeed the strength of feeling right across the public sector, including teacher workforce. And I recognise the desire from everyone to have their efforts recognised by way of a pay rise. Equally, I also understand the financial challenges councils face in common with the wider public sector, and the need for any pay rise not only to be fair to employees, but also affordable to the employer. I welcome therefore, that my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, writing to the Chancellor calling for a firm assurance about pay uplifts for the public sector workers, particularly for the lowest paid, and for this commitment to be reflected in devolved budgets. Now, whilst it is, of course, for local government, as the employer, to make any revised pay offer, I am absolutely committed to supporting a fair pay offer for teachers, and will work with the SNCT to conclude these negotiations as quickly as possible. Finally, although we have invested heavily over the past 2 years to ensure that additional teachers and support staff were available to support the response to the pandemic, I acknowledge that there have been a significant number of teachers currently working on temporary contracts. You have my assurance that I will continue to encourage local authorities to employ more teachers into permanent contracts, and I've provided a further £145 million to local authorities baselined into that local government settlement to enable them to do so. So, in conclusion, it is absolutely clear to me that the professionalism of our teacher and workforce and of our head teachers and the interaction between you and our children and young people is one of the greatest strengths that we have in our education system. So I would like to finish by again thanking you all and your colleagues right across Scotland, and indeed the EIS as an institution itself, for the continued support and dedication to ensure that our children and young people have continued to have support and guidance under the most difficult and challenging of times. Thank you.
That's not working. Thank you for your speech, Ms Somerville. We asked our delegates in advance of you coming to visit us this afternoon to put forward some questions, because you kindly said you would do a question and answer. There was a lot, so you'll be glad to say we've only chosen 4. But the rest of them we will forward to yourself so as you can consider them at your leisure. So I'd like to call upon Mark, please, to deliver the first question to the Cabinet Secretary.
What I'd like to know, and I'm sure everyone here would like to know, is whether you and your government think that is a real terms cut of 9% this year the amount of value you place on the sacrifices and dedication of teachers both during the pandemic and as we move through the recovery period?
Thanks very much. Again, as I said a little bit about the pay in my speech, you'll be well aware that negotiations are ongoing. I think we are still, I hope, at a constructive stage where people are genuinely trying to get the best possible and fairest pay deal that teachers can get, but also recognising the implications of pay deals across the public sector on restricted budgets both for local government and for the Scottish Government. I would say I think the Scottish Government has a strong track record for our support for teachers. We've of course backed a substantial 13% pay rise between 2018 and 2021, and that demonstrated that we were committed to ensuring at that time that we could deliver a fair pay rise. I'm absolutely committed to be working with unions and with COSLA to see what can be done this way so that we can have a fair pay rise, but recognising that we do have financial constraints both within the Scottish Government and within local government that we need to reflect the reality of that context and that situation within the pay discussions that we're having.
Thank you. Moving on to the second question now, and I'd like to invite James to come up and give his question.
Given that the massive issues we are seeing in schools post-COVID, with violent incidents on the rise and the mental well-being of staff and pupils severely affected, will the Scottish Government commit to properly funding ASN staff, school counsellors and specialist behavioural and wellbeing support staff, rather than just the current approach, which can often be whoever's free on the timetable can try and fill in for that?
Thank you, James. I appreciate, I know from what I've been following from the discussions over the past few days that there have been a number of debates and motions around the issues of ASN, and I've tried to follow that as best I can, but again, this has been something which has been raised with me previously by EIS colleagues. We recognise that there has been an impact of the pandemic on a number of ways on children and young people. We often hear a discussion about lost learning in some sectors, and that's not a phrase I'm comfortable with. I think, as I said in my speech, we need to look at mental health and well-being and learning and a holistic approach to children and young people. But we also, of course, need to look at the requirements of those with additional support needs that may have been there, of course, before the pandemic, may have been exacerbated by the pandemic, or those that may have particular challenges as they've returned to school following lockdown. So we see a number of ways that I think we can approach that. I think part of that is the increase in teacher numbers, an increase in the numbers of support staff. So we see an additional 2,000 more teachers than pre-pandemic levels. We've seen 1,000 extra pupil support assistants that have been recruited in 2021. And we're also seeing in another aspect of your question around the support from for school counsellors within secondary schools that are now in place, as well as wider support that can be there for mental health and wellbeing support for those right the way through the different primary as well as secondary. So I think we need to look at what can be done to ensure that that support is adequate. We have, of course, got the commitment, as we have done in the past, to continue £60 million worth of funding towards local government to assist particularly with ASN, and we are seeing the amount that's being spent on ASN increasing within the local government. But I recognise that this is an ongoing concern that the union has. I recognise it's a concern that many parents and young people have as we move out of the pandemic, that we need to look to recovery on this issue. And that's why I'm working very carefully, not just in education, but also with colleagues in health, to look at what can be done within schools, and also wider support within CAMS and within community services that will support children and young people that may again then help within school settings as well.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to the third question, and that is from Alison.
Hi there, Alison Beattie. I'm a primary school teacher in Glasgow and I'm also on EIS Council. Cabinet Secretary, I wanted to ask you today if you'll confirm that the reduction in class contact time for teachers will be used for teachers' own preparation and planning.
So thank you very much for the question, a very popular one in the hall. I'm not entirely sure my answer is going to be as popular as the question, but what I will do is explain the process that we're going through. So I can't give you a direct answer to what will happen to it, because we are in a process that the Scottish Government is but one part of. So the SNCT is looking at the issue of class contact time at the moment. Clearly, I would like to see an implementation date being agreed for that very soon. I think I hope to be able to do that soon. Clearly, the EIS and other unions would like to also ensure that we have, within that discussion, some deliberations about what that class contact time will be used for. And I would simply say, if we're going to have such a large change to class contact time, I think it's right that the employers and the Scottish Government have a discussion with teachers about that class contact time before a final decision is made on that. I think that's a reasonable thing for the Government and for COSLA in local government to be asking for, if that investment is to be made into teachers and into their class contact time. So I would very much like to see progress on the implementation date, but I think it is fair to have a discussion about that class contact time and how that can best be used to support our children and young people. And that's the type of discussion I think that we would like to have, and my understanding that COSLA would like to have as well, about how to best use that class contact time to support children and young people.
You can tell by the strength of feeling in the room that that's not our opinion on that, and we are the experts and we know what we need. Moving on to question 4, I'd like to invite Nicola, please.
Thank you, President. Nicola Fisher, primary school teacher in Glasgow and convener of the EIS Equality Committee. Cabinet Secretary, given the rollout of free school meals to P6 and 7 is now delayed, given there has been a refusal to extend this to secondary pupils, as if hunger stops at the secondary school gates, and we don't accept excuses about the size of dinner halls on any of the other fig leaves we've heard to date, given you declined to meet with the STUC Women's Committee on this matter, and given it took 5 months for us to receive a reply when we wrote to you on this issue, what assurances can you give the delegates in this room and teachers across Scotland that child poverty and child hunger are actually a priority for the Scottish Government?
Thank you, Nicola. I think would absolutely point not to the work just within education, but also what we're doing right across the Scottish Government on child poverty to absolutely demonstrate that we are very keen to take action and continue to take action on that. I give one example of that, of the Scottish Child Payment, something that's only available in Scotland. At the time when we were getting campaigned by organisations to deliver that, it was a Give Me Five campaign. We came in immediately as a government and actually said, no, we think that should be at £10. But we recognised as progress was delivered on the Scottish Child Payment that actually because of the pressures on families that actually £10 wasn't sufficient. £20, £25 is where we're moving to. And that's a very, very exceptionally large funding commitment that the government has rightly made, because we recognise that children and young people and their families need support, because we recognise the impact of child poverty on everything, but particularly on education. Within education, there's obviously been a number of other aspects that we've looked at around the cost of the school day, around school clothing grants, about core curriculum charges, etc., because again, recognition of the impact of poverty. When it comes to school meals, I think it is important that we do look at some of the practicalities. So one of the challenges if a school doesn't have sufficient catering facilities is what we might get into the situation is what you call a kind of brown bag solution, where children are given a cold lunch rather than a hotly prepared lunch. Now, in some families, that might be the only hot meal that that child is getting. So we need to look at the practicalities of what would happen if your provision of school meals gets ahead of where the capacity is. But that's why we've got within this financial year £30 million to allow local authorities to undertake changes to catering to ensure that we can move forward with the delivery of universal free school meals in primary 6 and 7, because of course we've already delivered on our commitment for up to primary 5. We have very much said we will look at piloting the free school meals approach within secondary schools as well, and we're very keen to move forward on that. Again, practicalities will have to come into that too, about an understanding about how that can be done, but we're very keen to move forward on that, and again, the rollout of universal school meals for primary 6 and 7.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers.